Thank you so much, Heather, for your interesting talk.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to start by asking you, I guess there's perhaps a bit of a misconception out there that some people might think learning and memory is simple to study. How are they wrong?
Well, that's a great question. So there is abundant complexity to the types of learning and memory that can be studied. So the example that I gave you of spatiality and memory type, you can, when we're studying, for example, non-human animals, we can't use language the way that we use language. So we have to teach the animals the task so that we know that they've acquired the rules before we can really understand if they've formed the memory. So an example might be for the water radial arm maze that I showed you. An animal might swim halfway down an arm and then leave, and then go halfway down another arm and then halfway down another arm, and never really have learned that the platform is at the end of the arm. Well, how can we determine if the animal has a low, medium, or high working memory load capacity if they haven't even learned the rule that the platform is at the end of the arm? So that kind of dissociation is really critical when you're looking at learning and memory science using, for example, rodents and also monkey work. There's a lot of studies where people spend a lot of time doing the control tasks to make sure that the animals are able to tell us what they learn. So there is also an inherent complexity to the different types of memory. So, I told you that spatial memory is memory outside the maze, non-spatial memory is inside the maze. That's the way that we operationally define it. And in fact, if an animal receives a hippocampal lesion, then typically those animals are no longer good performers on a spatial task. However, if we move the cues closer to the maze, or even move them in the maze, then the animals can perform. But the reality is, let's think about it, we're talking inches, right? So if we move it inches outside the maze, now all of a sudden it's a whole different brain region that is, guiding this phenomenon that we're talking about. So, operationally defining these things are so important, but as scientists, we need to criticize ourselves, and we need to think about whether what we're calling a particular type of memory because our operational definition is really the reality of what's going on. So I think those types of checks and balances are really, really important, and that is why it's so important that our manuscripts go through peer review. This is why it's very important that when we're training the next generation of scientists, we are critical in that they hear us, they hear how important it is to control for all of these variables. Because what we think may be the case often really turns out to not so much be the case. And many times I've seen in my own laboratory something we were pretty sure about that we've replicated multiple times, that, for example, maybe we had to give a hormone 3 weeks later for a logistical reason, but we got a totally different effect. So does this mean this hormone doesn't work in this way anymore? Certainly not. It just means there's an entire new area that we need to study now. Why is delaying hormone treatment for several weeks resulting in a different effect? And that's how it kind of snowballs so that we can piece together this very complex organ that is the brain so we can understand cognition.
Always more questions.
Always more questions.
Always more questions when we try and answer a question.
I'd be out of a job if there were no more questions.
A little bit of follow-up on that, but as you're doing your studies, are there ways that you incorporate individual differences or personality into any of your work?
Absolutely. We often do correlations, which is looking at the relationship between individual scores of particular subjects. And oftentimes we get an inverted U. So for example, here's our axis, and we'll have a relationship here that starts off positive, and then it's neutral, and then it's negative. And that study of the way that individual subjects respond is really critical, because especially if we're trying to translate to human health, which is what our lab does, it's really very, very critical that we take into account all of this variability and this variation in response, because none of us are alike. So even though we may be testing genetically identical animals, there are still many, many facets that go into making them very individual. You know, there's the maternal behavior, there are different, aspects of handling different types of situations that result in different outcomes at the end. And it's very important to consider all of those things if we're going to understand outbred populations like us.
Sure, definitely, thank you. So again, following up on that, if we are bringing scientific knowledge and trying to translate it to real life and real world, how are you doing that on a daily basis? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, that's a great question. So one of the things we do in our lab is we are looking at ways to optimize brain health as aging ensues regarding reproductive senescence. And by that I mean menopause. We're looking at different menopause trajectories that can optimize brain aging and brain health when old. And there are many different types of exposures that people have. So there's very early exposure that organizes the brain to hormones. That's an endogenous exposure, it's coming from within. There are exogenous exposures that are happening even in teenage years now, like birth control. Those are exogenous hormone exposures. There's another big endogenous hormone exposure, pregnancy, tons of estrogen and progesterone. And then there are also changes such as menopause, and every woman is faced with the question of whether or not to take hormone therapy once menopause ensues, even if menopause is a natural transitional menopause or surgical. So one of the things that we're being very careful to do is to model these types of trajectories that women have and the decisions that women are faced with. And we are testing some of the hormones that women use that they are prescribed in the clinic to try to understand what the longitudinal consequences of those hormones are. And I think making sure that we are using the same types of hormones that women are given is really, really critical to translating, because an estrogen is not an estrogen. There are multiple types of estrogen, and in fact, the most commonly prescribed exogenous estrogen in birth control is ethinyl estradiol, and that is a synthetic estrogen that does very different things to the brain than natural estradiol. So understanding the difference between all of those different types of hormones that people are given is really critical to optimizing brain health as aging ensues.
And it's always great, I guess, considering the flow through from human research and how that affects practices within canine research as well. Like I know that cognitive decline in dogs as they age, and also things like the effects of neutering are something that a lot of people are putting time and effort into researching at the moment. And bringing it back to dogs, can you tell us a little bit more about why your dog was named Prozac?
Yes. Our dog was named Prozac because she made us all very happy. I tried for Sunshine, but my husband quickly vetoed that. So as a joke, I said, well, what are we going to call her, fluoxetine? And he said, how about Prozac? And it stuck. So we were at the dog park screaming Prozac.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, thank you for inviting me.
We greatly appreciate it. And we are going to be back after lunch. You all get to eat. We all get to eat. Very exciting. And so we'll be back at 2 p.m. on the dot with Dr. Marta Gacci, and she'll be speaking about the potentials of social learning in dog-human interactions. We look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.
And for the people who are awake at 3 a.m. somewhere, it's time to get more coffee. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.